The moment Sera Holloway walked into the Birchwood Grill that Tuesday morning, she could already tell something was wrong. It wasn't the weather, though February in Toronto had the kind of gray that settled into your bones and stayed there. It wasn't the Monday crowd spilling into Tuesday either, or the fact that her shift had started 12 minutes late because the 5-on-6 streetcar had stalled at Gerrard and Parliament, and she'd had to run the last 4 blocks in slush. It was the man at table 9. He was sitting alone in a wheelchair, a sleek, expensive-looking one, the kind that didn't apologize for itself, positioned near the window where the morning light came in sideways and caught the silver at his temples. He was dressed well, quietly well, the way people dress when they don't need to prove anything. A dark gray wool sweater, no logo, no flash. His hands rested on the armrests with a kind of patience that looked practiced. Across from him sat a woman. Sera noticed her immediately, not because she was particularly beautiful, though she was, in that polished, maintained way that suggested a lot of time and money spent on looking effortless. What Sera noticed was the woman's face, the way her eyes had landed on the wheelchair and hadn't quite left it, the way her smile had gone slightly fixed, like a photo that was printed just a half-second too early. Her name, Sera would later learn, was Claudette Beaumont. She was the kind of woman who entered rooms with the assumption that the room would be grateful. Sera picked up her order pad and moved toward the section. The Birchwood wasn't a fancy place. It was the kind of Toronto restaurant that had been there long enough to become an institution, with exposed brick and reclaimed wood and a brunch menu that tourists photographed and locals actually ordered from. Sera had worked there for 2 years. She knew every table, every regular, and every brand of awkward silence that could exist between 2 people sharing a meal. This silence had its own particular temperature. "Good morning," Sera said, arriving at table 9 with what she hoped was a neutral smile. "Welcome to the Birchwood. Can I start you both off with some coffee?" The man looked up. He had steady eyes, brown, unhurried. He smiled at her, just slightly, the kind of smile that didn't ask for anything back. "That'd be great. Thank you." Claudette Beaumont barely glanced at Sera. She was looking at her phone now, her thumb scrolling in that way that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that she wished she were somewhere else. Sera poured the coffee and withdrew. She was refilling the salt shakers at the service station when it happened. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The Birchwood was full. There were families with strollers near the front, a pair of contractors eating fast before a job, 2 women from the neighborhood who came every Tuesday and always ordered the same thing. Sera had things to do. But the dining room had one of those acoustical quirks where table 9 sent sound straight to the service station, and Claudette Beaumont's voice was not a quiet one. "I just want to be honest with you," Claudette said. "Okay," said the man. "I think you're lovely. I have to be realistic. I have a certain life, a certain image, I suppose." She paused. "My friend set this up, and I didn't want to be rude, so I came. But I think we both know this isn't going to work." "A beat. Could you be more specific," the man said, "about what this is?" Claudette's voice dropped, but not enough. "Look, I Googled you. I know you're successful. And that's wonderful, truly, but I need a partner who can keep up, who can come hiking in the Adirondacks, who can ski in Whistler, who can—" She stopped, gestured vaguely but unmistakably at the wheelchair. "Who can walk," the man said quietly. Claudette at least had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." The table beside them had gone quiet. The contractors near the window had paused over their eggs. Sera stood very still at the service station, the salt shaker in her hand, and felt something rise up in her chest that she recognized as the particular anger of witnessing something that should not be witnessed. Not because it was private, but because it was wrong, and it was happening in public, and the person on the receiving end of it had nowhere to go. Claudette was already collecting her coat from the back of her chair. She was standing up. She was doing it the way people do when they've already made a decision and just want the exit to arrive faster. "I'm sorry," she said, and she didn't sound particularly sorry. "I hope you find what you're looking for." She left. The dining room resettled itself, not all at once, but gradually, the way water resettles after a stone. People looked back at their plates. The contractors resumed eating. The 2 Tuesday women exchanged a look and said nothing. Sera walked to table 9. She didn't have a plan. She didn't think about what her manager, Doug, would say, or whether it was professional, or whether it was her place. She just walked over because she was the only person in the room moving toward him instead of carefully away. She set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, the first one having gone untouched and cold, and then she sat down in the chair that Claudette Beaumont had just vacated. This was, objectively, not something servers were supposed to do. "Hi," Sera said. "I'm Sera. I'm sorry about that. You don't have to say anything about it if you don't want to. She picked up the laminated menu and held it out. But the eggs Benedict here are genuinely the best in the city, and you drove all the way here in February, and I think you should at least eat. The man looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of someone who had recently been preparing for something difficult, and then found themselves somewhere unexpected instead. I'm Renfield Cross, he said. Sera Holloway. You sat down. I did. Server aren't supposed to sit down. No, Sera agreed. They're really not. Something in his face shifted. It wasn't quite a smile yet. More like the beginning of the decision to smile. Eggs Benedict, he said. Good choice. She stood up, straightened her apron, and went to put in the order. Doug, who had seen the whole thing from near the host stand, gave her a look that she couldn't entirely decode. She chose not to decode it. Renfield Cross left her a tip that was larger than the entire bill, with a note on the receipt that said, "Thank you for the coffee, and the company." Our Sera tucked it in her apron pocket and thought about it for the rest of the shift. She thought about it on the streetcar home, the 506 again, this time running on time. She thought about it while making pasta in her apartment on Carlaw, the small one she shared with her roommate Juniper, who was a PhD student and was always either brilliant or exhausted, and tonight was somewhere in between. You sat down at the table, Juniper said when Sera told her. I sat down at the table, during your shift, during my shift. Juniper considered this while eating pasta directly from the pot. Was he cute? That's not. Sera paused. That's a complicated question. Oh no, said Juniper. You like him. I don't know him. You sat down at his table. He'd just been publicly humiliated by a woman who couldn't get her coat fast enough. Juniper pointed her fork. You like him. Sera took the pot away from her. The thing was, she thought about Renfield Cross not because he was handsome, though he was. In that way she hadn't let herself fully register during the shift. She thought about him because of the way he'd looked when Claudette left. Not devastated, not humiliated, but something quieter and more complicated. Like a person who was used to being surprised by the limits of other people's imaginations and had never quite gotten over finding it sad. She thought about him for 3 days. On the 4th day he came back. Same table, same gray sweater, different shade this time. More blue. He asked for Sera's section. Doug gave her a look she also chose not to decode. You came back, she said. The eggs Benedict, he said. Right? Also, he said, I wanted to apologize. I think I made your job more complicated last time. Sera pulled out her order pad. You didn't make it complicated. A woman who left without paying made it complicated. She looked up. She didn't pay. Renfield Cross looked startled, and then he laughed properly, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that was embarrassed and genuine at once. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I covered it. He stared at her. You covered it. I work here, Sera said, as if this explained it, which it didn't really, and they both knew it. Let me give you. You left a very large tip last time. She clicked her pen. Eggs. He looked at her. Eggs Benedict. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. He always asked for her section, and she always brought him coffee before he ordered, and they talked. In the small, interruptible way that conversation works when one person is working, and the other is technically just having breakfast, but somehow it was always more than that. She learned. Renfield Cross was 41. He ran a mid-sized investment firm that had, over the past 8 years, become a not-so-mid-sized investment firm. He'd been in the wheelchair for 6 years after a skiing accident, which, he noted with dry amusement, meant he was quite good at skiing, right up until he wasn't. He had a mother named Harriet Cross who lived in a large house in Forest Hill and had very specific opinions about everything. Harriet, he mentioned once, had already heard about Claudette Beaumont leaving. Does she know about the eggs Benedict? Sera asked. She knows about everything, Renfield said. Eventually, it was 5 weeks into Tuesday breakfasts when he asked her if she would like to have dinner with him, not at the Birchwood, somewhere she wasn't working. Sera looked at him for a beat. Is this the part where I say something like, I don't usually do this? Is it true? She considered. No, I never do this, then say that instead. I never do this, she said. Yes. The problem began 6 days later and came from a direction Sera hadn't anticipated. His name was Scott McGuire. He was the general manager of the Birchwood. Not Doug, who was the floor manager and essentially harmless, but the man above Doug, who owned a piece of the restaurant and wore a blazer to work every day as though the restaurant were a law firm. He called Sera into the back office on a Thursday. Scott McGuire was the kind of man who framed things carefully. He didn't say what he meant. He said something adjacent to what he meant and waited to see if you'd catch up. He told Sera that her extracurricular interactions with customers had been noted. That the Birchwood had a certain reputation to maintain. That fraternizing with guests, His word could create a perception problem. Sera sat across from him and kept her expression professional. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, though she was fairly sure she understood exactly what he meant. Scott Maguire leaned back. And then, because he was the kind of person who sometimes misjudged the room, he said, "Look, Sera, Mr. Cross is a significant patron of this restaurant. A man like that, connections, money, he notices things, and I've noticed that you've been given his attention." He smiled. "That's a valuable thing. I want to make sure it benefits everyone, including you. If you could, put in a good word. Mention the private dining room upstairs. Mention that I'd love to connect with him about a potential investment opportunity." Sera looked at him for a very long moment. Then she took off her apron. She folded it neatly on the edge of his desk. She was, despite everything, a tidy person, and she stood up. "I won't be doing that," she said, "and I won't be coming back on Saturday." Scott Maguire blinked. He hadn't expected this. People who needed their jobs didn't usually do this. "Sera, let's not be dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic," she said with the particular calm of someone who has already made the decision and is just waiting for the exit. "I'm being clear. There's a difference." She walked out through the kitchen, waved to the line cook named Tomas, who had always been kind to her, and left through the back door into the cold February alley. She stood in the alley for a moment, her breath making small clouds in the air. Then she called Juniper. "I quit my job," she said, a long pause. "During your shift, after a meeting. It was semi-professional." "Oh, Sera, I know. Was it about him?" Sera leaned against the cold brick. Above her, a pigeon was doing something unreasonable on a fire escape. "Not the way you think. It was about me." She didn't tell Renfield. This was a choice she made deliberately and then, over the following 2 weeks, began to feel less certain about. She found another job, a coffee shop on Queen Street East, shorter hours, less money, and she was fine, mostly. She'd been fine before. She knew how to be fine. What she hadn't expected was how much she'd begun to depend on Tuesdays. Not the money from the shift. The hour of interrupted conversation, the coffee that she brought before he ordered, the specific way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him, like she'd just moved a piece on a board he'd thought he understood. She missed it in a way that was difficult to explain to herself and impossible to explain to Juniper, who was too perceptive by half and would simply say, "Again, you like him," and would be correct. She didn't tell him she'd left the Birchwood because she thought he might blame himself, because she thought if he knew he might feel like he owed her something, and she didn't want him to have that weight. She didn't want to be someone's obligation. They'd had dinner twice by then. Once at a small Italian place on College Street where the tables were close together and the wine was good, and once at an oyster bar on King where a jazz trio played in the corner, and Renfield had an argument with her. A cheerful, engaged kind of argument, the kind Sera privately thought was the best kind, about whether Toronto winters were character-building or simply miserable. "Character-building," he said. "Miserable," she said. "You have to find the beauty in them." "With what hands? My hands are too cold." He laughed. She thought, watching him, that she could probably get into very serious trouble with this person. The kind of trouble that rearranges things. She still hadn't told him about Scott Maguire. But 3 weeks after the alley, sitting across from him at a small cafe on Roncesvalles where she'd suggested they meet because she couldn't walk him into the Birchwood and explain the situation naturally, he looked at her and said, "You're not working at the restaurant anymore." It wasn't a question. "No," she said. "I'm not. What happened?" She looked at her coffee. She thought about saying something vague. She'd rehearsed something vague. But Renfield Cross had steady eyes and she'd never been able to say untrue things to people who looked at her like that. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was his way. He didn't jump in, he didn't fill silences, he let you finish. When she was done, the cafe made small ambient sounds around them, milk being steamed, a door opening and closing, someone's phone. "He asked you to use your relationship with me," Renfield said, "to broker an introduction for his own benefit, yes, and when you said no, he implied I was making a poor professional choice." A pause. "And you folded your apron on his desk. It seemed like the right place for it." Renfield looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she couldn't immediately name, something careful and warm and a little undone. "Sera," he said, "you didn't have to protect me from knowing that." "I wasn't protecting you," she said. "I was protecting me. I didn't want you to think I was." She stopped. "I didn't want it to change things between us. Did you think it would? I didn't know what you'd think." He reached across the table. He had good hands. She'd noticed that at the Birchwood that first day, and he placed one of them over hers, carefully, like he was making a statement he wanted to be clear about. "I think," he said, that you are the most straightforwardly decent person I have met in a long time. And I think the fact that you quit your job over that rather than spend 30 seconds using me is one of the least surprising things I've learned about you." Sera looked at their hands on the table. She thought about the alley and the pigeon and Juniper's voice on the phone and Tuesdays and Eggs Benedict. "I'm at a coffee shop now," she said, "on Queen East. The hours are bad." "Tell me about it," he said, and so she did. The first time Sera met Harriet Cross, it was at a Sunday lunch at Harriet's house in Forest Hill, and Harriet was exactly what Renfield had implied, and also somehow more than that. She was a small woman. Sera hadn't expected her to be small, with very good posture and very direct eyes, and she wore a cashmere sweater in a precise shade of claret, and she looked at Sera the way a person looks at something they haven't decided about yet. The house was large and tastefully cluttered with the accumulation of a life fully lived. Art that meant something, books that had been read, photographs of a family over decades. Renfield moved through it with the ease of someone who'd grown up there, and Harriet moved through it with the authority of someone who ran it, and Sera moved through it trying to be both pleasant and honest and not knock anything over. Lunch was roast chicken and roasted vegetables and a green salad that Harriet said she'd made herself, and Sera believed her, because Harriet did not seem like someone who lied about salad. The conversation was polite for approximately 15 minutes. Then Harriet said, "You're a server." "I was," Sera said. "I'm at a coffee shop now. Renfield told me why you left the restaurant." Sera glanced at Renfield, who had the expression of a man who had calculated that transparency was the better strategy and was now discovering whether he'd been right. "Then you know more about my employment history than most people I've just met," Sera said pleasantly. Harriet looked at her. "You could have just done what that man asked." "Yes, it would have cost you nothing. It would have cost me something," Sera said. "It just wouldn't have shown up on a bill." A pause. The Sunday afternoon light came through the dining room windows and fell across the table. Harriet Cross looked at her son and then back at Sera, and something passed through her expression that Sera couldn't quite parse, something that might have been calculation or might have been recognition. "More chicken?" said Harriet. Sera took more chicken. The lunch ended. Harriet walked them to the door, and just before Sera stepped out into the cold, Harriet put a hand briefly on her arm. Light, just for a moment, and said, "I'll make the salad again." It was not, Sera thought, a grand gesture. It was not an apology or an endorsement, or any kind of official stamp of approval, but it was Harriet Cross and it meant what it meant. "I'd like that," Sera said. Scott McGuire didn't lose his job in a dramatic way. He lost it quietly, over the following months, as a series of things came to light. The way he'd spoken to other staff, the way he'd managed or failed to manage complaints, the way several servers had quietly left over the past 2 years for reasons they'd never quite articulated. It wasn't Renfield's doing, not directly. Renfield had, when Sera finally told him the full story, made one phone call to the actual owners of the Birchwood, who were a couple in their 60s who cared about the restaurant's reputation and didn't know half of what was happening in their own building. What happened after that was between the owners and Scott McGuire, and was, as these things go, tidier than it deserved to be. He didn't face a tribunal. He was simply not there anymore. One day in March, and Doug the floor manager got a quiet promotion and immediately introduced a policy about management not meeting privately with staff without an HR witness. Tomas the line cook texted Sera about it. "He's gone. Thought you should know. Then the Benedict isn't the same without you, honestly." She read it on her lunch break at the coffee shop on Queen East, sitting by the window with a cortado she'd made herself because one of the benefits of the job was free drinks. She smiled at the phone. She was still smiling when Renfield came in. They'd planned this. She'd told him she was working until 2, and he maneuvered between the small tables with the easy practice of a man who'd long made peace with navigating other people's spatial assumptions. And he ordered a coffee and sat across from her in the winter light, and she showed him the text. He read it. "Satisfied?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Mostly," she said. "Not because he's gone. Because the people who stayed are a little safer." Renfield looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You're going to be a problem for me," he said, in a voice that made it clear this was not a complaint. "Probably," Sera agreed. "Sorry." "No, you're not." "No," she said. "I'm really not." The thing that Harriet said later, not at that first Sunday, but at maybe the 7th or 8th, when she and Sera had progressed to the kind of relationship where they could have real disagreements over the salad course and then agree over the dessert. The thing she said was this: "I worried about him." After the accident, not about his legs, about what he would decide to believe about himself. She was quiet for a moment. The Forest Hill house was peaceful on Sundays. Some people decide they are smaller than they were. They let the world's reduction of them become their own. Sera didn't say anything. She'd learned that Harriet, like her son, finished her thoughts. "He didn't," Harriet said. "But I worried, and then Claudette Beaumont happened, and I worried more." She looked at Sera with those direct eyes. "And then you sat down at his table." "It was inappropriate," Sera said. "Professionally, probably," Harriet said. "But the right things often are." The Sunday in April that Renfield proposed, and he did it on a Sunday, at the Forest Hill house, in the garden that was just coming back from winter, with Harriet deliberately and obviously absent in the kitchen making noise with pots. The Sunday he proposed, Sera said yes before he'd quite finished asking. He stopped. "I hadn't gotten to the question yet. I could tell where you were going." "Sera, yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Ask the question." He laughed. He asked. She said yes again, more formally, and then laughed too, because it was April in Toronto and the garden smelled like mud in the beginning of things, and somewhere in the kitchen, Harriet made a sound that might have been a drop pot and might have been something else entirely. They were married in September, at a small restaurant on Roncesvalles. Not the Birchwood, not anywhere that had a history attached to it, but somewhere they'd found together and chosen together, with windows that let in the last of the summer light and tables close enough together that the whole room felt like one conversation. Harriet cried during the ceremony. She would later deny this. Juniper was Sera's maid of honor and gave a speech that was funny and accurate and mentioned Eggs Benedict 3 separate times, which Sera had told her not to do and which she had done anyway. And at the table nearest the window, the one that caught the light best, the one Sera had quietly asked the venue to reserve, Scott McGuire's replacement at the Birchwood, a woman named Patricia who had worked her way up from the floor and run a genuinely good room, sent flowers. A small card with them said only, "The Benedict is better now. Congratulations." Sera put the card in the pocket of her wedding dress and kept it there all evening, her hand finding it occasionally the way you find a good thing you'd forgotten you were carrying.